Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. Tonight, I would like to have a follow up discussion on the recently released Al Jazeera uh, documentary, Gold Mafia in Zimbabwe. I thought initially when I first heard about the documentary that it was going to put the flesh on the bones. We will now know the extent of the looting of Zimbabwe's resources. I must admit, I never believed 1 minute that it could be so intense, unbelievable. Corruption anyway in the world is a serious problem, and the consequences are equally serious. Because invariably, where there is corruption, you find resources are being creamed off to benefit the few at the expense of the majority. And those few do not invest their loot, or very rarely invest their loot, in the country where they're doing the looting, because they know if things change, they will be asked, where did you get the money? Where did you get the wealth to build that empire? And so they will always try invariably to build a nest somewhere else. And invariably end up with a situation where the gold is coming from, the country becomes incredibly poor, and where the looted wealth is going, they become incredibly rich. So the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon once said that we shouldn't look at corruption as the billions of dollars that are being wasted by the few uh, rich, but also in terms of the lack of basic infrastructure like hospitals, schools, clean running water that the countries from which the wealth is being looted suffer. Tonight, I'm not interested in the consequences of corruption. I'm interested in how to stop it. And in Zimbabwe, corruption is now a runaway train. How are we going to stop it? I'll just play you a clip of the Al Jazeera um, documentary, give you a flavor.
We're going to bring in Eddie Cross. He's a former opposition member of parliament in Zimbabwe. He's joining us from Harare. Very good to have you with us, sir, on Al Jazeera. What's more striking about this? What's happening, how it's happening, or the scale of it?
Well, to be frank, the two episodes that have been flighted by Al Jazeera so far have really not had anything that we weren't aware of. I mean, it's fairly well known that a high proportion, 70% of the gold marketed in Zimbabwe is smuggled across our borders. And the cigarette trading activities, smuggling activities of the two Rudland boys is also a well-known feature of regional economics, if I can call it that. I think the shocking point of the whole story for me has been the allegations about the involvement of the monetary authorities in Zimbabwe, and the fact that this is money laundering on a fairly large scale. and it might influence the international authorities. We've just been taken off the grey list. South Africa has just been put on the grey list because they thought that we had improved the way we were managing our foreign exchange flows and trade flows. This is very damaging from that point of view. I think also the impact on Dubai. Dubai is now the largest gold market in the world, and they won't be happy at all with these allegations of them being in receipt of gold, which has no real origin. And I think the world gold community is moving towards a time when they're going to ban such gold movements, similar to the blood diamond industry. So I think it's very serious. None of us in Zimbabwe are saying it isn't. The question is what to do about it and how to regularize the situation. And that, I think, needs attention. The other thing I just thought I'd say to your colleagues, I watched episode 2 tonight, and the allegations about the involvement of the president, I think, are very, very shaky. I don't believe that he's involved in this sort of activity directly. And this allegation that $200,000 buys an appointment to see him is just plain rubbish.
Let me ask you then.
There was a time.
Forgive me for interrupting,
but when one of his.
I'm so sorry for interrupting you, but I do want to pick you up on one thing, or get you to expand on one thing. If this is so intrinsic to society, where does the responsibility for oversight lie? Does it lie with the banks who have perhaps failed in that regard, or does it lie with successive governments who are aware of the situation and either cannot or will not do anything about it?
I think it lies with government, ultimately. I don't think you can really blame the banks. I think the banks will take very swift action against the individuals who've been identified tonight. But ultimately, I've been absolutely mystified as to how 70 tons of gold transit the South African border, and we never see anybody being arrested. And that simply points to collusion at the highest level in South Africa. It's the same with cigarette smuggling. They catch the odd consignment, but we know that cigarette smuggling on a very large scale takes place across the border with South Africa. The industry is massive, and billions of rand are involved. And I do not understand why the authorities, who clearly must know about this, why they don't take more effective action.
I want to
on our
ask you
side
about
of the fence.
Sorry, go on, please.
Yeah, I was going to say, on our side of the fence in Zimbabwe, I think we have a real obligation to put our house in order and to do it quickly. And we know what to do. And it wouldn't be difficult, and it wouldn't cost us any money. We'd actually make money out of the deal. But that's a political decision.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that, because our report was saying there that it's estimated there's about $1.5 billion that's lost every year to the economy. Clearly, that is money that any country would be glad to have. How do you break the cycle in this? Because if it's reaching from the lower levels right up the way to the highest echelons, as you were talking about, where do you break that cycle and start to change the system?
Well, I think the 1.5 billion is an underestimate, substantial underestimate. Transparency International reckon we've lost $100 billion US since independence 42 years ago. That's more than $2 billion a year. I think the losses through this kind of activity run to many billions of dollars. But look at the Gupta scandal in South Africa. I mean, my goodness gracious, the scale of that and the audacity. It's just mind-blowing.
Let me ask you about the point that you made. Let me ask you about a point that you made earlier on. You said that the banks were likely to take very swift action as a result of what they've been learning. We've heard already in the report that some of them are already addressing it. And yet you did mention that you were not able to work out how the government was actually going to respond to this. What would be the best way for the government to respond to this?
Well, I can tell you that the so-called pastor, the guy who claimed to be a Christian pastor, has been stripped of his diplomatic passport. In fact, he's had his passport removed from him, and the president has stripped him of all status. He might, in fact, fail jail time. I know that one of the big white gold traders has fled the country with his family. And I would imagine that there will be other elements inside that story against which action will be taken. But, you know, the fundamental problem for African states, can we identify them as just plain African? You know, maybe it's a global problem. This question of corruption and when it takes root, the Chinese, I think, have the right approach. Corruption is a criminal offense, and it is subject to the most severe punishment that's in the book. And I think we've got to do the same thing here.
Eddie Cross, we appreciate you joining us on Al Jazeera. Thank you very much indeed for your time, sir. Thank you.
There we have it. It's an interesting idea, but it really doesn't answer or address the big issues here. I find it unbelievable that Eddie Cross, and to be fair to him, he was one of the few when he was in the GNU who were willing to tackle the problem of looting head on. He was the one to flag the diamond looting in Chiaza and Marange, and in the GNU lasted 5 years, and the looting still continued past the GNU period. In other words, the GNU did not stop the looting at all. And here we are. And in his suggestion here that they are taking away of the diplomatic passport from Hubert Angel is government stepping in to address the problem of corruption is absolutely laughable. I think it should be dismissed with the contempt it rightly deserves. That is only picking those few individuals as the fall guys. That is not going to stop corruption. The problem will still remain. That is what is at issue here. How can we meaningfully end corruption in Zimbabwe? In my view, we have got to address it in terms of the government itself. We have had an incredibly corrupt and incompetent government for 43 years and I'm counting. And in that period, it's not that Zimbabweans didn't realize that ZANU-PF was failing them. They did, but they couldn't do anything about it because ZANU-PF rigged the elections. This is the root cause of our problem. As long as ZANU-PF is able to rig the elections, and we are going to go for an election in a few months' time, and at the present moment, ZANU-PF is set to rig those elections. And ZANU-PF will remain in office. One has got to look at a president who appoints Zimbabwe's first ambassador at large, Hubert Angel, somebody who is at best a third-rate corrupt individual. It really didn't. He only had to send somebody to say, who is this guy? And they would have told them, no, Mr. President, you don't want to deal with this guy. You know, his activities, how he makes his money is so dubious. It's unbelievable. And yet, that is the man he appointed ambassador at large. Of course, we can't complain of corruption being rampant when the people at the very top of government are themselves involved in it. What is it that Mnangagwa has done to merit his wealth? Mnangagwa is one of the richest countries in Zimbabwe. We cannot deny that. And I'm sure you will not deny it either. Same applies to VP Chiwenga. When he was having his problems with his wife, the first one, Joyce or something, in the divorce papers submitted in court, he had not only the mansion, he had a string of cars, or the couple had a string of cars, farms, and for his own personal benefits, he had 45 gold watches. At the time, he was the commander of the Zimbabwe Defense Forces. There is no way you can tell me could the salary of the commander was that good that he could afford the mansion and all those other goodies. No way. Of course, he was one of the beneficiaries of the looting of diamonds in Marange and Chiazwa. The army has always had their Chinese partner since 2006 or thereabout, and they have been looting, and the beneficiaries didn't even have to declare their earnings for tax purposes. And he and his colleagues in the army were the beneficiaries of that. The same applies to the CIOs, the police. Mugabe himself had his own claim there. Mai Mujuru had their own Churusha Mai Mujuru. Corruption has been rampant in Zimbabwe. And to think that we can just end it by firing the odd individual small fish is ridiculous. Each time a big fish is arrested in Zimbabwe, it is well known. It's catch and release. And the corruption continues. The only way we can deal with corruption in Zimbabwe is to stop the case of rigged elections. One of the things that this documentary, Al Jazeera, revealed is how powerful the gold mafias are themselves. Most of them are the white guys really pulling the strings at the top. They are the ones who are really making the real big bucks. They have got so much control, they've got so much wealth, that they are the ones who are bankrolling the ZANU-PF machinery, keeping ZANU-PF in power. The Kenyan guy, Kamlesh Patel, he was working with former Kenyan President Arap Moi. And when Arap Moi finally left office and things got a bit hot in Kenya, he moved to Zimbabwe. And they had since been working for initially Robert Mugabe, and now he's working for Mnangagwa. In the documentary, one of the things that he said clearly was that his activities helped Arap Moi survive by buying the opposition. The billions of dollars he was making, he used some of it to bankroll Arap Moi's re-election, to keep him in power and to buy off the opposition. When you look at Eddie Cross, one of the things that he has avoided answering is why is it that the opposition failed to implement even one meaningful democratic change in Zimbabwe during the 2008 to 2013 government of national unity. That was the primary purpose of the government of national unity. Implement the democratic reforms and you will stop ZANU-PF rigging the elections. They failed to implement even one meaningful reform. He has never commented on it, but of course, we all saw what happened on the ground. Robert Gabriel Mugabe was good at bribing people. In fact, within a few months of forming the government in 1980, he reportedly gave all his ministers Mercedes-Benz limousines to drive home to replace the Peugeot 404, 406s that Ian Smith had given his ministers. Some of the ministers have admitted that, and it's true, that those limousines were not in the outgoing Ian Smith government's budget, so they were not budgeted for. And cabinet had never even discussed them. But who could refuse them? None. And it is this kind of things that kicked off Zimbabwe's biggest problem, political patronage, where Mugabe bought the loyalties of those around him. And it is well known that Mugabe's cabinet was one of the most useless cabinet in the world. Even at the peak of the Kukurahundi massacre, the cabinet did not stand up and say, no, this is not right. They didn't. And our friends, Eddie Cross and his friends in the MDC, when they joined the government of national unity, they were given similar treatment, bribed. And they forgot about the reforms completely. Not even one meaningful reform was implemented during the GNU. And they've been participating in these flawed elections, knowing fully well that ZANU-PF is rigging these elections. But they were willing to participate because they also know ZANU-PF is giving away a few gravy train seats. This is where the Gold Mafia comes in. Their role in bankrolling ZANU-PF and bankrolling the opposition has undermined the country's chances of having a competent government. We are not going to have free, fair, and credible elections as long as the mafia are around. And as long as they have the opportunity to interfere with the process, they will interfere with the process. At the present moment, although the ZANU-PF government has failed to produce something even as basic as a verified voters roll, Mnangagwa himself is recorded. There's an audio of him boasting of how ZANU-PF is going to frog march the rural voters to make sure that they vote for ZANU-PF. He has already bought off the villagers and the chiefs, and they are now acting as ZANU-PF political commissars. In some rural areas, the opposition cannot go there because these villagers and chiefs will not allow them to campaign in their area. These are no-go areas, they claim. And yet, the opposition will participate in these elections, regardless. One has got to ask why. Surely, election processes, if they're going to be free, fair, and credible, they've got to follow certain rules. And to say that you will participate regardless of how flawed the process becomes, how illegal the process becomes, one has got to ask, why are you doing that? Surely there must be red lines, which you can say, well, these are the red lines. If you cross these, I'm not going to participate. Particularly when I know participating will only give you legitimacy, which is what is happening here. And yet, the opposition will participate. We have got a runaway train in Zimbabwe when it comes to corruption. If we are serious about stopping it, we must also be serious about making sure there is democratic reforms leading to free, fair, and credible elections. Yes, it is too late to get any meaningful democratic reforms now if the elections are going to be held in August. So be it. What can we do now? Well, what we can do now is denounce these flawed and illegal election processes. Now, we don't have to wait until the morning after the elections. It'll be too late then. We must denounce them now. And we must also denounce the opposition for participating, knowing that the process is flawed. Also for failing the nation by failing to implement even one meaningful democratic reforms when they had the golden opportunity to do so during the 2008 to 2013 GNU. We are not going to allow ZANU-PF to have political legitimacy born out of a flawed and illegal election process and backed by the participation of a totally discredited opposition. We are not only dealing with ZANU-PF in these elections. We are also dealing with a corrupt opposition. And behind the two, we are also dealing with the mafia, the real big shots who are controlling Zimbabwe's political system and financial system. They have got the resources to buy off whoever they like. They are determined to maintain the status quo. Zimbabwe's political system is like a sewage pond. We will never have quality leaders out of this sewage pond. We need to drain it. We need to implement the democratic reforms and have a clean start. The mafia who are controlling the looting of our diamonds, gold, everything, are not going to allow Zimbabwe to drain the sewage pond. They are happy with the dunderhead leaders in the ruling party and in the opposition and will maintain the status quo. This is the fight we are facing. And I think we should know our enemy and fight accordingly. We are determined to make sure that we have got no legitimate government coming out of this flawed process. That is our starting point. Achieve that, and we will have an opportunity to have a new GNU in which we can finally implement the democratic reforms and give Zimbabwe a real chance of ending the curse of rigged elections and bad governance. Food for thought. Thank you very much and good night.